Jim Morrison and Pamela Courson, two soulmates, one of the most beautiful and tragic couples of the 60s, or maybe just two junkies locked in a deeply toxic relationship. Love them or hate them, they remain a subject people can't stop talking about. And I'm no different. That's why when I finally came across Angel Dance and Angel Die, I bought it immediately, as this is the book that has very positive reviews, and I've seen it used quite often as a serious source when people talk about Jim and Pamela's relationship. For those who don't know, Angels Dance and Angels Die is a book by Patricia Butler that presents itself as a biographical account of the relationship between Jim Morrison and his longtime partner Pamela. One of the reasons the book is often described as unique is because it promises to focus more on Pamela and tell us more about her story. But I don't want this video to be just a review of the book. I will be using it more as a starting point alongside other sources that often present completely different versions of events. My goal is not to push one correct narrative, but to explore the different perspectives that exist, because there are many and rarely they agree with each other. Especially when it comes to Pamela, opinions can be incredibly polarized. But before we look at the relationship of Pam and Jim through the lens of this book and through other accounts, I think it is important to understand who Jim and Pamela were before they became cosmic soulmates. So let's start with Jim Morrison. Since his childhood, Jim was a strange, sensitive, and extremely curious kid. He was born into a strict military family and spent his early years moving from one place to another, never staying long enough to form real friendships. His favorite hobby was reading. He was obsessed with poetry and anything that felt mysterious or philosophical. Teachers always said the same thing about him, that he was a brilliant kid but completely distracted. Apart from reading, Jim's other hobby was to shock people. He loved telling unsettling stories, always adding a few details just to see how others would react. And of course, some of the stories sounded very convincing, which is why most people still can't tell whether something truly happened to Jim or if it was just another wild tale that he made up on the spot. Stories like this eventually carry over into his young adult years in Florida. One of these tales actually made it into this book. Patricia interviewed one of Jim's childhood friends who claimed that Jim once told him that he had slept with an older man, but that same friend also admitted that Jim loved saying shocking things just to mess with people. But I guess Patricia wasn't satisfied with the idea that it could be just a made-up story, so she tried to prove that Jim was bisexual. And the so-called proof is that when Jim was living with his grandparents and attending college in Florida, he became a regular at a local coffee house, and the owner of that coffee house was a gay man in his 40s who hinted that something might have happened between them. He also claimed that Jim performed there often, reading his poetry while playing the ukulele. That part surprised me the most, as it completely crashes with what his bandmates always said, that Jim couldn't play any instrument whatsoever. He didn't know any chords, he didn't play guitar, and the only things that we actually saw him ever touching were harmonica or piano. On top of that, John Densmore mentioned that Jim was extremely shy in the very beginning, performing with his back to the audience. So I don't know, I can imagine Jim reading his poetry in some random coffee house, but the ukulele part seems a bit strange. So I guess that's one of the reasons why the bisexual proof didn't really convince me. There is another reason I'm skeptical, as during that same time in Florida, Jim was dating his first serious girlfriend, Mary. Her story has always been extremely blurry. The only thing that we learned is that Jim and Mary spent a lot of time together, and Jim was very different around her. He was very calm and gentle, and that's all that the book tells us so far. But don't worry, we will be back to Mary a bit later. Now let's get to the Pamela, the person the book claims to focus on the most. Pamela is introduced as a difficult child, someone who always did the opposite of what she was told. People who went to kindergarten or school with her said that they hardly remember her ever talking at all, which leaves us with very little concrete information about her early years. What we do learn is that she was somewhat reclusive and grew up in a family that didn't mix much with neighbors. She attended Orange High School in Orange, California, but didn't really enjoy it. We are also told that she did extremely horrible at school and eventually left it before finishing. But right after that, several people insist that she was actually very capable and very intelligent. Unlike Jim, there aren't lots of dramatic stories from her childhood that have been widely recorded, but the picture that we get from biographies and interviews is of a creative, independent person who didn't quite fit the mold of a typical schoolgirl and was already leaning towards art and freedom even before she met Morrison. I know that this might sound like a collection of small details, but that's honestly all the chapter gives us, and other sources don't give us more information either. And just for the comparison, here's how big is the chapter about Jim and how small is about Pamela. And just to remind you that this is the book that claims to center Pamela and not Jim. But while Pamela's early life is full of mystery and small details, we shouldn't forget that during the same period, Jim had already started experiencing his first serious relationship that shaped him, or if not him personally, then definitely the sound of the Doors' debut album. So let's go back to Mary. In the following chapters of Angel's Dance, Mary is portrayed as a very beautiful girl who worked as a go-go dancer and really wanted to make it big in her career, but at the same time you get a cold vibe from her. We learned that she didn't believe in Jim and thought that she was too good for him. Butler cites Raymond Zarek, who said that Mary once told Jim that she was going to the big time and didn't think he would ever make it. The book also presents another possible reason for the breakup, as Brian Gates, a former college roommate of Jim, claimed that Mary got involved with some kind of small sect and eventually she ran off to India, leaving Jim behind. So that's what the book says about Mary, that she was ambitious, a little distant, and just someone who didn't quite see Jim's full potential. That's valid considering the fact that this book is published in 1998 and there weren't many other sources about Mary at the time. But in 2005, Mary herself gave one single interview describing everything from her point of view. What she said paints a bit of a different picture. She described her relationship with Jim as intense and deeply connected, not some puppy love as the book might suggest. Mary also said that Jim rarely drank around her, respected her, and even proposed to her more than once, but she always said no. She thought that they were too young. She followed him to Los Angeles, where he was studying film, and she pursued dancing. But Jim didn't like her dancing hobby. He started doubling her commitment and thought that she's gonna leave him. After one of such fights, Jim went out with another woman and didn't come back the next morning. Mary says that this was the beginning of the end. They split up in the summer of 1965, but still saw each other from time to time. So basically, according to Mary, the breakup happened because Jim cheated on her, and she also denies what Raymond Zarek said, that the band is no good and you will never make it. She says that she never told him that. The idea that she ran off to India immediately after leaving Jim is also inaccurate as far as I understand, as in reality Mary moved to India in 1968 to study meditation, so years after their breakup, so probably the roommate got the timeline wrong. Personally, I feel like Mary and Jim's relationship always had a ring of truth to it. Reading her interview, I would say that she seemed really sad and full of regret. It is just overall a very sad read, and just to realize how she ended up is very not nice. But what I definitely respect about her is that she had all of the opportunities to profit from her relationship with Jim. She could have published some books or even asked for royalties, since the first album is just totally about her and everyone confirms that, but she never did, and in a way that's really respectful. So while Jim was dealing with his breakup with Mary, Pamela just arrived in Los Angeles. According to a friend of hers at the time, they basically did very little, just wandered around the city and took a few art classes at Los Angeles City College. No one seems to remember seeing Pamela with a boy during this period, so her life was mostly independent and quiet. As for how Jim and Pamela actually met, the stories are all over the place. No one seems to know the real details. The story that makes the most sense and the people tend to believe is that they met at the London Fog, a small club in LA where the Doors used to perform. The first man who actually noticed Pamela was John Densmore. He says so in his book Riders on the Storm, but Pam wasn't quite attracted to him, so Jim quickly took his place. Overall, attraction and appearance play a huge role in pretty much all the stories about Pamela, whether it is this book or other sources. They mostly just gush about how Pamela looked, but none of them can tell you anything about her as a person, about her character or some personality. Nothing. Anyway, what we do know is that she and Jim started living a life together that was chaotic, intense, and very much on their own terms. Their relationship was very clearly open, but even though they were open, it didn't make things easier. Their new partners only added fuel to the fire, as Jim was constantly dating other women and Pamela often tried to punish him by sleeping with his close friends. Even though they lived this unconventional lifestyle, Pamela wanted to marry Jim. Patricia Butler wanted it even more, as she pushed this idea that Jim and Pamela tried to obtain a marriage license multiple times, but nobody ever remembers actually seeing one. Later, in court papers filed after Jim's death, Pamela claimed that one of the reasons they didn't follow through was because the Doors management supposedly wouldn't allow it. But Jim friends and honestly anyone who ever knew him said immediately that this is just not true, as Jim would never in a million years do something that the Doors manager wanted him to do, and he clearly wouldn't avoid marriage just because they told him not to get married. Since Jim couldn't commit in the traditional sense, he expressed his devotion in other very material ways. For example, he bought them a house, and as soon as he started earning even more money, he bought Pamela a clothing boutique. Originally, they wanted to call it fucking great, but for whatever reason, Pamela eventually chose the name Themis. One of the designers who worked there said the shop was incredibly exclusive because it was basically never open, but despite the weird schedule, the place itself was stunning. It was beautiful, curated, and deeply personal. Almost like Pamela had built herself a tiny space in the middle of Los Angeles. She loved fashion, she loved traveling, she loved meeting interesting people, and Themis felt like the place where all of those passions finally came together. The guy who shot the photos remembered thinking that Jim seemed genuinely proud of what Pamela had created. Apart from the materialistic things, perhaps the greatest commitment Jim ever offered Pamela was the dedication of his poetry book. His poetry meant everything to him, so giving them to Pamela probably meant way more than just a wedding ring. Unfortunately, none of this truly helped their situation. As time went on, their relationship slowly began to fall apart. Pamela traveled constantly and Jim was always on tour. Both of them were surrounded by people who only made things worse. Pamela became addicted to heroin supplied by her new boyfriend from France, and Jim couldn't stop drinking. Eventually, desperate for a fresh start and some sort of escape, they decided to run away to Paris. In Angel Dance, their time in Paris is described almost as a rebirth. Butler cites Alain René, who spent several days with them there, saying that Jim wrote nearly every day and that he seemed to have completely reclaimed himself. Other accounts in the book say that people who saw them in Paris remember them as calm, happy, and genuinely enjoying their days together. They didn't take drugs and Jim wasn't drinking. For the first time in years, he seemed grounded. He even talked about wanting children. For a brief moment, it felt like they had finally escaped everything that had been tearing them apart, but suddenly Jim died. And from this point comes the whole speculation about what really happened in Paris. Unfortunately or fortunately, we will never truly know, as the only two people who knew the full story are both gone. But the film The Final Days of Jim Morrison offers one of the clearest reconstructions of those weeks. According to the film, a model named Elizabeth, from whom Jim and Pamela rented an apartment for 4 months, remembered Jim as a calm, charming, and gentle man. She said he spent hours writing, with notebooks and books scattered everywhere, and that he genuinely loved the city. But because he was always alone, he eventually started drinking again, partly out of boredom. What struck Elizabeth most about Pam and Jim was how separate their lives were. She barely ever saw them together. They lived like two strangers sharing an address. About Pamela, she said that she would sometimes lock herself in her room, which worried Elizabeth, but whenever she tried to check on her, Pamela would brush her off, insisting that it was none of her business. The actress Zuzu, who saw Jim frequently in the last 2 or 3 weeks of his life, described Pamela as a planner, someone who liked organizing everything, and she said that usually Pamela would simply just come to Jim, ask for money, he would give it to her, and when she would return an hour later, everyone around would quickly scatter. That was some kind of a sign. Jim also rekindled an old friend in Paris with the Belgian-born French filmmaker Agnès Varda. In Paris, he told Pamela that Varda was the only person in the entire city he felt like he could trust, but having a good relationship with Jim didn't mean that she would have a good relationship with Pamela. Agnes was concerned about Jim's well-being and Pamela's heroin use, so she sent a doctor to their apartment, and the healer later said that Jim was open and kind, but Pamela's energy was dark and unsettling, so he quickly left. Pamela resented Varda after that, as she hated being treated like a child, especially by a woman in her 40s with kids. By this point, the distance between Jim and Pamela only deepened. Jim distrusted the rich French drug dealer Pamela was spending time with, and Pamela didn't enjoy Jim's company either, especially as he slipped back into drinking and melancholy. On top of that, Jim's asthma started to progress. That's why most people say that he seemed unwell and very sad and exhausted. Several people later said that they felt like his days were counted. And they were, as on July 3rd, 1971, Jim died officially of a heart attack at the age of 27. The funeral, just like Jim's final days, remains surrounded by mystery. As far as I remember, Angel Dance claims that it was Pamela who chose the burial spot, believing that Jim would have wanted to rest among other great artists. But in reality, the story appears far more tangled. Agnes Varda recalled that Jim once told her that he loved the French countryside, and that's why she and Alain René first searched for a small country cemetery, but they quickly learned that it was impossible because you had to be born in the village to be buried there. So it was just way too complicated to arrange. That's why they turned to Père Lachaise, and there was a designated section for foreigners. He was buried on July 7th at 8:30 in the morning. The burial was modest. A woman who witnessed the burial later called it disgraceful. Only 7 people presented during burial: Pamela, manager of the Doors Bill Siddons, Agnes Varda, Alain René, and personal assistants of Jim and Pamela Robin. The entire process took barely 10 minutes. Agnes said a few words, and then, just like that, it was over. Everyone left quickly, and none of them ever returned. According to Angels, when Jim died, Pamela's parents and Bill's wife were waiting for Pam and Bill at the airport. Apparently, during that time, Pamela's mother asked Bill's wife to announce that Jim and Pamela were married, and that's how the news was reported. Bill Siddons later said that he didn't see Pamela again for months after that. Eventually, the book claims that she reconnected with him and unleashed his help to design a headstone for Jim's grave. Bill supposedly created the design and sent it along with the money to cover the cost to Agnes Varda. As the book and letter says, she was the only person Pamela supposedly trusted to see it done. But the problem is that the headstone was never made and no one knows why. Overall, the whole narrative about the money, the headstone, and who did what is just incredibly messy. It is almost unbelievable. What's clear, however, is that after Jim's death, Pamela ended up fighting for control of his estate. Jim had left a will that explicitly gave her everything, but in reality, most of his fortune was tied up in royalties owned to Elektra Records or subject to claims from his bandmates. To put it simply, he had almost no liquid cash, and what Pam did inherit was not a fortune but a huge legal and financial mess. Everyone who was ever connected to Jim, they wanted to get some of his money. Jim's will was drafted extremely poorly. Because of that, Pamela had almost no practical protection. Legally, the only way for her to receive actual money from the will and not just debt was to push the idea that she should be recognized as Jim's legal wife or common law wife, because being recognized as a wife would give her unquestionable control over royalties and image rights. It would give her protection from debts or claims, and of course it would maximize the inheritance. Basically, Jim's estate was complicated and Pamela's attempts to assert herself as a wife were a practical way to protect what he had left her. Some people see it as some incredible type of greed, but to others it looks like the opposite, as they see it more like Pamela was defending Jim's wishes from the Doors and Elektra Records, and just basically anyone else who tried to stood to profit from his death. Either way, Pamela never got to see any of that money, as she died at the age of 27 from a heroin overdose. Angel's Dance claims that after returning from Paris, she was completely clean, never touched drugs again, even moved out from Los Angeles for a year to live a calm, quiet life. When she returned to LA, the book says that she dated a man who looked just like Jim Morrison, but she could never truly recover from his loss, and that was essentially the end of his story. Other sources tell a different version. One story suggests that she met a man within just a few days of coming back from Paris, and she lived with this man for about 10 months. After they broke up, she left behind a box containing Jim's poems and journals, and she never went back for them, and they were later sold after her death. Some of the Doors' surviving members have said that she never stopped using heroin, which is also why she supposedly needed the money from Jim's estate so badly. The whole problem with Jim and Pamela, especially during their time in Paris, is that everyone presents a black and white picture of their relationship. There's no middle ground, and to me their story is neither the most romantic love story of the 60s nor the most toxic relationship ever. I just think that they were just two people who clearly needed some help, and for some reason nobody could give it to them. Both Jim and Pamela were extremely young, both struggling with serious drug problems. I don't think it is possible to measure how much they truly loved or hated each other, because most of the times neither of them was in a state of mind to really feel or act clearly. But what upsets me the most about this story is not that we will never know exactly what happened to Jim in Paris or whether they really loved each other. No, it is that none of the people who gave countless interviews, wrote books, made films, or sold some private journals and photos of Jim and Pamela seemed to care about them as real people. There were so many witnesses, so many stories, yet none went to the authorities to report what they had seen. No one seems to step in to protect them or help them or just honor them in any type of way. Everyone in Jim's circle likes to just shrug and say that, oh, we were so young, it was just the 60s and we didn't know that the person could die from the alcohol, which is, of course, sure, maybe they didn't fully understand the risk of drugs and alcohol at that time, but they clearly understood that Jim's estate could make them money. That part apparently didn't require any genius level thinking, I guess. Anyway, everything that I just told you about them could be none of it true, because what I definitely learned from this research is how little control they had over their own story, both in life and after death. Pamela and Jim, and basically everything about them, was filtered through other people. Everyone had an angle, a version, or a claim, but very few seems to see them as real humans with real feelings. Now it is your turn to tell me, what do you think about Pamela and Jim and overall this whole stuff that I just described you? So don't forget to leave a comment, and thank you so much for watching.